The forbidden orbit had no official name. In documents, it existed as a blank space between lines, a pause no one dared fill with words. Navigation databases of various agencies designated it differently, but the essence remained the same: C12/Omega, sometimes simply an omega contour, sometimes a black mark without a label. On star charts, this region of space was filled not with color, but with the absence of color, a mad hole, as if someone had intentionally cut out a piece of reality. Any attempt to plot a route through this area ended the same way. Navigation AIs, even the most advanced, began rerouting the course, suggesting detours, increasing fuel consumption, adding unnecessary maneuvers, anything to avoid crossing the boundary. If the operator insisted, the system would request confirmation, then a second, then a third, and then it would simply freeze, as if faced with a logical impossibility. Formally, the ban was absolute. Not a single instruction explained the cause. There was no mention of radiation spikes, gravitational anomalies, vacuum instability, or unknown forms of matter. The reports didn't even offer any speculation. Only a dry statement. Flights prohibited. Violation of protocol is unacceptable. Dozens of theories circulated among the pilots. Some spoke of an ancient military experiment gone wrong. Others of contact with something undetectable. Still others claimed the orbit didn't exist at all, and the ban was merely needed to conceal the routes of top-secret flights. But they all agreed on one thing: don't fly there. Over the course of 40 years, 13 ships had disappeared around the S12/Omega boundary. The number wasn't classified, but it was never publicly disclosed. Each incident had its own explanation: engine failure, navigational error, collision with micrometeorites, loss of communication. However, if you compare the dates, trajectories, and classes of ships, a strange pattern emerged. They all came too close. The few crews that were successfully recovered were officially considered rescued. Unofficially, they were kept out of the missions. They didn't go crazy, didn't display aggression, didn't claim to have seen monsters or other worlds. On the contrary, they were frighteningly calm. Too collected. Too careful in their wording. Their testimony was always logical, yet at the same time, they didn't agree on key details. And most importantly, they all avoided the same question. How long did you spend there? Because none of them could answer. That's why, when the decision was made to send Helios 7, the mission was internally classified as Protocol of Silence. The launch was kept under wraps. There were no journalists, no live broadcasts, not even the formal speeches customary for such events. The launch platform was operating in night mode, and the official reports read, Maintenance flight. Scheduled maintenance of orbital infrastructure. In reality, it was a test. Not of orbit, of the crew. Commander Marcus Edward Hale received the order 48 hours before liftoff. The document was short and composed as if it had been written not by a human but by an algorithm devoid of doubt. Hale read it twice, then closed the file and didn't ask a single question. He had seen similar wording before. It always meant one thing: no answers were provided. He understood that Helios 7 was not supposed to return a hero. If the ship was lost, it would be written off. If it returned, it would be forgotten. Navigator Linerai had noticed the discrepancy in the route even during the data download phase. Technically, the course led to a system of calibration beacons, but the waypoints were too precise, too carefully constructed, as if someone were plotting a trajectory not toward the target but toward a boundary. She could have reported this. She could have demanded clarification. But instead, she simply accepted the data and stored it in her memory. She knew, if she asked a question, they would either replace you or make you part of the problem. Engineer Thomas Gray spent longer than the others checking the ship. He was alarmed by the number of redundant circuits related to spatial orientation and telemetry recording. Such excessive measures were used only on experimental missions involving unstable environmental physics. But the accompanying documents made no mention of this. Medic Sarah Miller discovered medications in the medical bay that were not part of the standard kit. They were intended to suppress dissociative states, stabilize memory, and correct time perception. Someone had placed the order in her name, using valid access. She said nothing. None of the crew mentioned the name of the forbidden orbit out loud. But in the final hours before launch, each of them, one way or another, thought about the same thing. About the empty space on the map. About the forbidden orbit without explanation. And about the fact that if the reason isn't given, it's impossible to accept. When Helios 7 undocked from the platform and began its acceleration, the silence protocol was already active. All recordings were sent to a closed circuit. All external channels were restricted. Anakinna. And ahead, beyond the calculated orbits, lay a region of space that asked no questions and accepted no answers. The Helios 7 belonged to the medium-range research vessel class, but upon closer inspection, it became clear it hadn't been designed for science. Its internal compartments were reinforced with additional bulkheads, evacuation routes were duplicated, and the autonomous life support system could sustain the crew in isolation for significantly longer than the stated duration. The ship looked like a compromise between a civilian and a military design, no exposed weapons systems, but with an architecture designed for a situation in which help wasn't forthcoming. Marcus Hale knew such ships. He'd served on similar platforms, where every bolt had a dual purpose, and every empty niche offered the possibility of installing equipment best left undiscovered. The Helios 7 was precisely that, standard on the outside, open to the unknown on the inside. Before launch, Hale led the crew through a formal briefing. He didn't add a single word of his own. His calm wasn't feigned. It was the state of a man who had long since accepted that some orders exist outside of logic. For him, the mission began not with launch, but with the moment he realized that return wasn't a prerequisite for success. Linnarai had taken her place at the navigation station an hour before liftoff. She carefully studied the route, not trying to find any errors. There were none. The trajectory was too clear, too perfect, as if calculated not for real space, but for a mathematical model in which there were no chances. The checkpoints were especially alarming. They didn't conform to the standard course correction logic, yet they fit perfectly with the energy consumption calculations. Lynn felt that the route wasn't leading somewhere, it was leading to something. Engineer Thomas Gray spent most of his time in the technical compartments. His attention was drawn to the orientation system. It was reinforced by independent gyroscopic units and redundant computers, not connected to the main AI. This solution was used extremely rarely, only in cases where there was a risk of distorting external reference points. Gray couldn't recall a single mission where such measures were excessive. Sarah Miller's medical bay was prepared for both a long flight and acute psychological stress. Diagnostic modules constantly monitored the crew, recording the slightest changes in neural activity. The medications she had previously discovered were now carefully distributed into emergency access containers. Sarah understood that her role in this mission went beyond medicine. She was supposed to monitor not only the bodies, but also how the crew perceived what was happening. Several hours had passed since launch. Helios 7 was smoothly entering its calculated trajectory, and outwardly the flight was no different from hundreds of others. Communication with the control centers was stable, telemetry was transmitted without interruption. And yet, a feeling of something wrong was gradually growing inside the ship. Not alarms, but discrepancies. Hale noticed it first. Not in the data, not in the reports, but in the pauses between actions. The crew worked harmoniously, but too silently. As if each of them intuitively understood that unnecessary words might capture what was best left undefined. Lynn caught herself returning to the same calculations several times. They always matched. But the feeling that she had already performed these actions never left her. It wasn't a memory, but its shadow. Gray found an entry in the engineering log made by his account, but not by himself. It concerned a check of the backup orientation loop, and was dated to a time when he was definitely on a different level of the ship. The entry was error-free. Sarah noted the first subtle deviations in all crew members, a decrease in emotional variability, a leveling of reactions, a slight dulling of the subjective perception of the duration of events. So far, this was within the limits of flight adaptation. But something else was alarming her. These readings were too synchronous. A few hours before the estimated approach to the restricted area, Hale received an automatic mission update. It contained no new information, only a confirmation of current instructions and a reminder of the silence protocol. He took this as a sign. The ship wasn't supposed to ask questions. The crew, too. When Helios 7 finally left the dense navigation corridors and entered the zone where communications were beginning to thin, a peculiar silence settled within the ship. Not a physical silence. The system noises remained the same. It was the silence of anticipation. Each crew member sensed in their own way that the mission was entering a phase for which there were no instructions. And that the ship itself, with its reinforced systems and strange architecture, was built not for flight, but for a meeting. The approach to the restricted orbit began as a routine procedure. The calculated trajectory, verified several times in simulators, held course with centimeter-level accuracy, and technically everything was going perfectly. But something elusive was felt in space, like a subtle vibration that couldn't be measured by instruments. 6 hours before the boundary, the first oddities began to appear. Communication with the relays began to lag. Not completely lost, but delayed by milliseconds, then seconds, then minutes. Hale monitored the data, trying to figure out what was happening, but the chronometers and navigational calculations remained stable. This discrepancy between the subjective time on the bridge and the time in the system was alarming. Lynn checked the navigational data several times in a row. She knew that while the ship was outside the restricted orbit, these anomalies were normal spacetime: solar winds, field instability, microscopic changes in gravity. But in her experience, such glitches had never formed a pattern. Every data packet arrived with precision, as if the delay had been calculated in advance. Thomas Gray in the engineering bay recorded an increase in the load on the orientation gyroscopes. They were operating abnormally, although all calculations showed standard parameters. Gray checked the cables, the power supply, the status of the units. Everything was perfect. He couldn't find an explanation. The reporting system recommended continuing the flight. Sarah Miller monitored the crew's psychophysiological indicators. Heart rates were normal, but EEGs showed synchronous fluctuations in the range responsible for the perception of time and space. No crew in the history of missions had ever demonstrated such precise harmony. This wasn't illness or stress, it was a deviation of reality itself within the ship. Hour after hour, Helios 7 approached the boundary. The external sensor's reflection of the star field remained stable, and this contradicted the velocity data. Every star remained in its place, despite the ship's maneuvers, accelerations, and rotations. It felt like the first visual signal that the normal laws of space did not apply here. The crew noticed something more subtle. Inside the ship, a feeling arose as if they had been here before. Not a memory, but a haunting shadow of the past. Lynn recalculated the coordinates several times. The calculations matched previous checks, but she couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. Gray recorded the same system parameters he had already checked, and Sarah noted the same synchronization of brain waves. Commander Hale watched silently. He understood, all of these were signs of the influence of the zone they were approaching. He sensed the presence of a law that was not named, not explained, and not discussed. A law that forbade questions and demanded complete silence. In the last hour before orbital entry, Hale gave the signal to prepare all systems. The engines were set to stabilization mode, all auxiliary circuits were activated. Silence reigned on the bridge, no one spoke. Words could disrupt the rhythm of space. And then the moment had arrived. Helios 7 crossed the border. At first, nothing changed. The engines were running, navigational indicators were normal, telemetry was stable. The outside world outside the portholes looked normal. Stars, planets, space objects, everything was in its place. But the sense of order proved to be an illusion. Lynn noticed, the landmarks had stopped shifting. No movement, no change in parallax. Space looked like a flat panel, defying the laws of motion. Thomas Gray inspected the systems. Everything was functioning, but the internal gyroscopes were registering deviations that shouldn't have existed. Sarah Miller recorded an increase in the synchronicity of brain activity among all crew members. Suddenly, time became relative. The clocks on the bridge were running normally, the ship's chronometers were functioning perfectly, but the subjective sense of time passing disappeared. Minutes stretched, moments compressed, and no one could discern how much time had passed since entering the restricted zone. The crew began to notice strange visual phenomena, reflections of their own ship in space, brief double images of inexplicable objects. Lynn tried to record these events on video cameras, but the equipment showed only a normal cosmic field. Reality seemed to be split. The brain recorded one thing, the instruments another. Thomas Gray discovered that some backup systems were activating independently, without the operator's input. They maintained the ship's orientation and adjusted course without intervention. Gray realized that the ship seemed to be adapting to the spatial anomaly without the crew's input. Sarah noticed the first signs of a psychological effect. The crew began to simultaneously experience similar feelings of anxiety and confusion, although previously their reactions had been individual. This happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, but the result was clear. The group merged into a single consciousness, a sense of. The fusion of time and space became collective. Hale realized they had entered a realm where linear time was disrupted and space ceased to be unambiguous. Any decision, even a simple course change, could be either already made or not yet made. The crew found itself in a state where the past, present, and future coexisted simultaneously. He adopted an internal rule, not to try to interpret what was happening, but to perform only necessary actions. Any reflection, any attempt at analysis could lead to disorientation and unpredictable consequences. For several hours, Helios 7 moved along a line that remained straight to an external observer, but an endless loop to the crew. Each maneuver was repeated with deviations recorded only by internal sensors, creating a sense of repetition. This was the first contact with an orbital law that defied explanation. A strange, closed-off feeling developed inside the ship. The air, the light, the movement of the instruments, everything remained unchanged, even though the system confirmed changes in trajectory and equipment status. Lynn stopped checking the readings. She realized her calculations were meaningless in this area. Gray monitored the systems, but understood that any intervention would not change what was happening. Sarah recorded brain patterns, but knew that correcting them was powerless. Hale, at the command post, realized for the first time that the ship had become part of the orbit itself. Helios 7 hadn't simply crossed a boundary, it had entered a state where space and time obeyed an unknown logic. Every action had consequences that could be sensed only through one's own perception, not through the instruments. The ship and crew were simultaneously observer and observed. And any movement now depended not only on the laws of physics, but also on the incomprehensible law of the forbidden orbit itself. At that moment, Hale realized that the mission was no longer about exploration, it was about survival in a space that defied conventional logic, and about maintaining the integrity of the crew's minds as they moved deeper into the unknown. Entering the forbidden orbit was not smooth, but abrupt. Through the viewports, space changed its behavior. Stars ceased to shift, planets froze, comets abandoned their trajectories and seemed frozen in midair. Even the slightest maneuver of the ship did not produce the expected parallax, and the entire outside world appeared like a motionless panorama that could not be disturbed. The engines were functioning properly. The orientation system, duplicated and reinforced, continued to adjust course, but the data showed something strange. The ship's speed and coordinate changes matched in the logs, but visually there was no movement. It seemed as if Helios 7 was moving through a space that refused to accommodate movement. Hale watched the instruments and the viewports simultaneously. He felt space become dense and elastic, as if trying to hold the ship in place. Every movement was sensed through a resistance that was impossible to measure with standard sensors. It wasn't pressure or gravity, it was the incomprehensible resistance of the orbit itself. Linnerai tried to plot a course, but the trajectories on the map didn't match what her eyes saw. Every landmark remained in place, despite the ship's movement. This created a feeling of disorientation, as if her brain couldn't cope with processing information about space and time. Her fingers automatically ran over the panels, recalculating coordinates, but the results always returned to their starting points. The limits of her logic had been reached. Thomas Gray recorded strange phenomena in the engineering bay. The backup gyroscopes were triggering without command, adjusting the ship's orientation as if it were colliding with the internal currents of space. Some instruments began displaying data that defied the laws of physics: negative velocities, coordinates outside the scanning range, energies that, according to calculations, shouldn't exist. He tried to disable autonomous systems, but they continued to operate, as if they had a will of their own. Sarah Miller watched the crew. Their physiology began to adapt to the new conditions. Their pulse remained stable, their breathing even, but their brainwaves exhibited an unusual synchronicity. Each crew member reacted simultaneously, experiencing identical feelings of anxiety, confusion, and mild dread. The internal time of everyone on board ceased to correspond with the ship's chronometers. Minutes could last for hours, seconds for moments, and no one could determine the precise flow of events. The crew felt a strange closeness to the ship. Every movement, every glance out the window, every system signal felt like a personal interaction with a living being. Helios 7 was no longer just a machine, it had become part of the orbit, part of the space they were traversing. Hale realized that their usual navigation methods were pointless. Any attempt to correct course became a repetition. Every action they performed seemed both accomplished and yet simultaneously incomplete. Space became circular, looping yet endless. Inside the ship, there was a closed system where the past and future merged with the present. Lynn tried to record the changes on the cameras, but the video recordings showed normal space, without any distortions. This reinforced the feeling that the crew's perception was now the only means of detecting the anomaly. Gray watched the instruments, but understood that their readings were only part of an illusion, controlled by the orbit itself. Sarah began recording data on neural patterns, but with each passing hour, she realized more and more that correction was impossible. The crew's brains had adapted to the immobility, synchronizing with space. Any interference could cause an unpredictable reaction, so she limited herself to observing and recording what was happening. Hale concluded, they had completely entered a mode where physics and psyche obeyed a new law. A law that had no name, that could not be explained, and that could not be disputed. Space had become alive, and the ship a part of it. Any attempt at resistance was futile. Through the portholes, space remained motionless, but the crew's senses began to shift. A slight vibration, a pulsation, an inner tension impossible to measure with instruments. They moved through static space as if it were choosing their trajectory, determining their pace and direction. The clock on the bridge continued to tick, but for the crew, every moment stretched. They understood, any understanding is only part of an illusion. Their consciousness became the measure of space. They were simultaneously observer and object, simultaneously ship and orbit, and every action was merely a repetition of what had already happened. Helios 7 became more than just a means of transportation. It became a mirror of the forbidden orbit, part of its law of immobility. The crew understood that returning to familiar space was impossible without the consent of the orbit itself. And as long as they remained inside, they were one with it, without the right to question or the possibility of an answer. The crew's inner world merged with the space beyond the porthole. Aeters. Stillness became their new reality. And only observation and complete silence could preserve their consciousness, allowing them to move in sync with the law of the forbidden orbit, which could not be explained. During the first hours of their stay within the forbidden orbit, the crew began to sense a gradual shift not only in external space but also in their own internal reality. Through the viewports, space remained motionless, the stars stood still, but inside Helios 7, the first signs appeared that their perception of time and body was beginning to distort. Sarah Miller was constantly monitoring. She noticed that the crew's brainwaves were beginning to synchronize to the extreme. The pulsation, frequency, and amplitude of oscillations coincided in everyone, creating a strange collective consciousness. This wasn't telepathy, but rather the effect of space on neural structures. The body's internal clocks ceased to correspond with external timepieces. Minutes felt like hours, and hours like moments. Every inhalation and exhalation felt like an act of existence stretched to its limits. Linnarai recorded inexplicable glitches in her sensory systems. The panels displayed familiar coordinates, but visually, space seemed stretched or compressed, sometimes repeating. She could see her own movement as a reflection in a mirror, not a real one, but rather an echo of actions yet to be performed or already in progress. Attempts to record video captured only the normal cosmic field, but the crew's internal perceptions did not match the instrument readings. Thomas Gray noticed strange behavior in the engineering systems. Autonomous units switched on and off without commands, adjusting the orientation even when the ship remained stationary relative to the stars. Internal gyroscopes detected motion that did not appear to exist. The system automatically adjusted to the anomaly, and any attempt to interfere resulted in the corrections disappearing, as if everything that was happening were part of the orbital law. The crew began to experience physical symptoms. At first, mild fatigue, sleep deprivation was not felt, but muscles tensed spontaneously. Later, a slight heaviness in the head developed, along with difficulty concentrating. Each of them felt a strange resistance to their own movements, although nothing externally impeded their movement. It wasn't pressure or gravity, but rather an internal sensation of resistance to time and space that they were trying to overcome. Medical equipment recorded an unusual synchronization of heart rhythms. The crew's pulse had become unified. Their hearts seemed to beat in unison with the internal rhythm of the orbit. Any attempt to disrupt this rhythm resulted in mild disorientation, dizziness, a sensation of movement that wasn't there, a strange emptiness behind the eyes. Hale observed what was happening from the command post. He understood that space controlled their perception, not that they controlled the ship. Every conscious action turned into a repetition, either already completed or not yet completed. It was as if they were caught in a loop where past, present, and future coexisted simultaneously. This sensation began to weigh on their consciousness, preventing them from fully focusing on rational analysis. After several hours, psychological symptoms appeared. The crew began to exhibit signs of collective perception, emotions smoothed out, individual reactions disappeared, creating a unified, neutral state. Fear, anxiety, irritation, all of it became synchronous, but without a specific source. Sarah understood that any attempts at intervention could cause irreversible psychological consequences. Lynn noticed that her memories were beginning to distort. She saw past events as the present, and current actions as memories. Every decision seemed a repetition of the previous one. Inner sensations took precedence over objective measurements. She tried to record coordinates and the state of the instruments, but she understood that their data was only part of an illusion. Gray detected energy fluctuations in the systems that could not be explained by physical laws. Energy shifted through the circuits without apparent cause, sometimes increasing the load, sometimes decreasing it. The ships seemed to react organically to the crew's presence, adjusting the system to their perception and psychophysiological state. Suddenly, on the bridge, a feeling arose that they were simultaneously inside and outside the ship. Her consciousness began to perceive the ship as an extension of her body, and her body as part of space. The boundaries between herself and external reality became blurred. They became part of the law of the forbidden orbit, without the possibility of resistance or choice. Hale realized these symptoms weren't side effects, not equipment errors, not the consequences of stress. They were a natural consequence of the zone itself. The forbidden orbit doesn't allow for individual perception. Any consciousness entering it adapts to the general rhythm, becoming part of a space and time that here don't obey ordinary logic. The crew could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion, past and present, their own actions and their repetitions. The symptoms intensified, slowly but inexorably. They realized that further advancement into the orbit would only intensify these effects. Any attempt. As they moved deeper into the forbidden orbit, the crew began to feel the direct impact of space on their perception and behavior. Effects previously noted as subjective and psychological became more pronounced. The body's internal clocks became unsynchronized, even with each other, creating the sensation that every moment was being stretched or compressed individually for each crew member. Sarah Miller recorded a gradual change in neural patterns. Brain activity became unstable. Synchronization would emerge and disappear, sometimes in waves, affecting everyone at once. The crew began to feel as if their consciousness was in a constant state of fluctuation between the present, past, and future. Every impulse, every sensation was amplified and distorted by space. Lynn Arai detected strange changes in visual perception. The stars outside the portholes were no longer points of light. They stretched into lines, spread into spots, and sometimes formed geometric shapes that defied the laws of physics. Attempts to record this on the cameras were futile. The instruments showed ordinary space. Lynn felt as if her eye's perception had become part of the orbit, as if reality was now being formed in the observer's mind. Thomas Gray noticed how the engineering systems were no longer following their usual logic. Autonomous units not only adjusted the ship's orientation but also sometimes altered the structure of internal energy flows, creating new load distributions. Sensors recorded deviations that should not have existed according to the laws of mechanics and physics. It seemed as if the ship was responding not to external conditions, but to the internal states of the crew. Hale watched all this in silence. He understood that the mission was no longer about exploration, but about adaptation. Every action required alignment with the internal state of the crew and the cosmos. Attempting to resist the laws of the orbit only intensified the effects of the fluctuations, causing a feeling of disorientation, short-term memory lapses, and an illusory sensation of time repeating itself. The crew began to experience physical changes. The slight dizziness began to intensify, leading to a feeling of heaviness in the head. The internal sense of the body ceased to correspond with actual movements. The crew members felt as if their limbs were becoming part of the ship, as if their movements were predetermined by the orbit. Even their breathing became synchronized with the pulsation of the inner space, but not with the surrounding reality. Sarah noted the first signs of fear, although it was not outwardly evident. The crew no longer showed individual emotions, but an internal sense of anxiety and tension intensified collectively. This fear was not of anything specific, but of the very structure of space, of a law that could not be understood and circumvented. Lynn tried to analyze the ship's coordinates in motion, but discovered the impossibility of predicting the results. Every decision, every change in course, was perceived as both an action already taken and a future one. This sense of repetition and predetermination intensified the psychological pressure. Gray noted that the life support system was responding to the crew's psychophysiological state. Pressure, temperature, oxygen supply, everything was automatically adjusted, creating the illusion that the ship was caring for them, but in reality, it was controlling everyone's perceptions. The ship became both instrument and subject. Hale realized that all their training, all their knowledge and skills, were part of the effect. The orbit was transforming every experience into its own reality, guiding the crew's actions. Understanding this didn't help, it only increased the pressure. And then, for the first time, a sense of subconscious influence arose, not human, not machine, but the orbit itself. It didn't simply control movement and perception, it shaped the crew's experience. Each crew member felt simultaneously observer and object, subject to its laws, which could not be named, measured, or disputed. A strange harmony reigned within the ship. Symptoms manifested, waxed and waned in an incomprehensible rhythm. The crew could no longer separate themselves from space, from the ship, from time. They became part of a single whole, a living system where individual will no longer existed. Hale concluded, the mission now was not to explore or return, but to survive within the orbital law, observing themselves, the ship, and their changing perceptions. Any resistance was pointless. Their task was to maintain the integrity of their minds and allow the orbit to guide them through the anomaly without violating the law of silence and stillness. And so, plunging deeper into the realm where space and time ceased to be linear, the crew realized that they no longer controlled the flight controlled them. And it was this understanding that became the key to survival within the forbidden orbit. After several days within the forbidden orbit, the crew reached the limits of their capabilities. Their internal clock ceased to matter. Breathing, pulse, and movement, everything became part of a single rhythm dictated by the orbit. Every conscious action felt like repetition, and every thought a reflection of someone else's or a future thought. Sarah Miller recorded the first obvious physiological effects. Their brainwaves remained synchronized, but their oscillations became sharp and chaotic, as if space were imposing a pulse, testing their stability. The crew began to feel a slight numbness, followed by a strange sense of separation within themselves. Their consciousness was separating from their body, perceiving it as an instrument rather than a part of themselves. Lynn and I noticed that their visual perception completely ceased to correspond with external reality. Stars and objects moved, but not according to the usual laws of motion. Sometimes they seemed to dissolve, sometimes they formed geometric shapes that were impossible to predict or interpret. Attempts to record this on instruments proved fruitless. The cameras and sensors displayed only a normal space field, but something else was happening in the crew's minds. Thomas Gray observed the engineering systems, which were now exhibiting independent behavior. The orientation contours were changing unpredictably, keeping the ship in a state of constant adaptation to the effects of orbit. Sensors were registering things that didn't exist, and life support systems were adapting to the crew's psychophysiological state. The ship had become a living instrument, subject to the laws of space. Hale realized that their control over the flight had been completely lost. Any attempt at resistance, any intention to change trajectory, was perceived by the orbit as part of the general flow of events. They found themselves in a loop where past, present, and future merged into a single experience. Understanding what was happening only intensified the pressure, making rational analysis impossible. The symptoms intensified, a feeling of internal heaviness and resistance to movement, disorientation, fluctuations in the perception of time. The crew simultaneously experienced acceleration and deceleration, movement and stillness. Every action was like an echo, a repetition of what had already happened, or a foreshadowing of what was to come. Sarah noticed the first signs of mental disturbances. The crew remained conscious, but their individuality was gradually fading. Fear, anxiety, worry, everything became collective, without a specific source. Every feeling intensified synchronously, creating the sensation of a single organism, subject to the laws of the orbit. Lynn tried to analyze the coordinates, but any calculations turned into repetition. Every course change felt both already accomplished and yet to be accomplished. The impossibility of predicting the outcome intensified the mental pressure and sense of powerlessness. Gray detected anomalies in the ship's energy flows. The systems were redistributing energy, creating new loads and states without external intervention. The ship responded to the crew's state, adjusting its internal conditions to psychophysiological indicators, turning every step of the crew into part of the laws of the orbit. Hale realized the mission had completely changed its meaning. They were no longer exploring or controlling the ship. Their task was to survive within the orbit, observing themselves and the changes it wrought. Any resistance or attempt at rational explanation only intensified the impact. The orbit was absorbing their consciousness, merging their actions with its own laws. The crew had reached the limit. Their consciousness had become part of the orbit, the ship part of their psyche. All attempts to return to familiar logic were futile. The only thing left was to observe, maintain their inner integrity, and allow space to guide them further, along a path that defied explanation. It was at this limit that they understood the ultimate truth: the forbidden orbit demands no answers and tolerates no questions. It exists in itself, and their presence is merely a testament to its law, infinitely immobile, incomprehensible, and inevitable. After long days within the forbidden orbit, the crew of Helios 7 began to feel the influence of space slowly softening. The symptoms gradually diminished, though consciousness remained closely linked to the orbital rhythm. The body's internal clock began to align with the ship's chronometers again, movements regained their usual ease, and psychophysiological indicators stabilized. Sarah Miller recorded a weakening of brainwave synchronization. Fluctuations became independent, individual reactions gradually returned. For the first time, the crew felt capable of perceiving themselves as separate beings, rather than as part of a whole subject to the laws of the orbit. This moment was both a relief and a dismay, for they realized that the orbit was still present, albeit concealing its influence. Lynn and I noticed that outer space had become dynamic again. Stars began to shift positions, planets moved along familiar trajectories, and comets resumed their orbits. However, there was still a feeling that space was watching them, that the laws of the orbit remained unchanged, and that any new attempt to penetrate its boundaries would be met with resistance. Thomas Gray recorded that the engineering systems were returning to their usual logic. Autonomous circuits no longer interfered with the ship's control without the crew's commands. Energy flows stabilized, and life support systems functioned as usual. Helios 7 had once again become a machine, not a living instrument capable of perceiving and adjusting the crew's internal state. Hale observed the recovery process, realizing that the mission had reached a critical point. They had passed through the forbidden orbit, experienced its laws firsthand, and now every particle of their experience remained with them. But they also realized that returning completely to familiar reality was impossible. The orbit had left an indelible mark on their consciousness, the realization that space and time could obey laws that could not be explained. The crew began to discuss their next steps. No one suggested re-entering orbit, and the thought of returning to a normal mission seemed strange and empty. Everything they had experienced had become part of their new experience, and their new understanding of space. They understood that they now carry knowledge of the Forbidden Zone without explanation, but this knowledge could not be fully conveyed to anyone, it could only be experienced. Hale decided Helios 7 would return to a normal orbit, to contact with Earth, to its usual routes. But they would remain silent about what had happened, for no words could convey the experience within the forbidden orbit. The crew knew that attempting to explain it would only lead to misunderstandings and possibly danger for future missions. As they left the forbidden orbit's influence, space gradually returned to its familiar laws of motion. The inner sense of harmony and stillness gave way to the familiar rhythm of the ship's life. For the first time in a long time, the crew felt safe, knowing that they were once again masters of their path. But deep in everyone's minds, the feeling remained that the forbidden orbit had not disappeared. It awaited new travelers, ready to test their boundaries, push their perceptions, and leave a mark that could not be erased. They knew that space was full of regions where one could not travel without explanation, and their experience served as a warning and a reminder that there were laws that defied human reason. Helios 7 slowly returned to its familiar orbit, but the memory of the Forbidden Zone remained with the crew forever. Every glance out the window reminded them that space is not only space and time, but also depths where laws have not yet been revealed and answers cannot be found in words. The Helios 7 crew returned to familiar space, communicating with Earth. The cosmos around them once again obeyed familiar laws, navigation became predictable, and the ship's systems functioned as usual. But within each of them, there remained a feeling that they had experienced something that could not be fully described or explained. Hale sat at the command post, gazing at the stars, which had once again become moving points of light. He felt the crew had been changed forever. Their perception, their understanding of space and time, even their inner harmony, all were shaped by the forbidden orbit. It had left an indelible mark, like a scar on their consciousness. Sarah Miller recorded all the data, but she understood that numbers and graphs would convey only a small part of what had happened. The core experience is subjective, internal, ineffable. It exists only for those who have experienced it with their own minds and bodies. Linnerai and Thomas Gray gazed silently out the viewports, feeling both relief and a slight unease. They knew that the forbidden orbit remained where it could not be disturbed. No one should retrace their steps without a full understanding of what awaited within. It was a testing zone, where past, present, and future merged, where space and time obeyed laws incomprehensible to the human mind. Hale adopted an internal rule: silence was their only defense, and also a testimony. They returned to continue their missions, but the experience of the forbidden orbit became part of their consciousness forever. He knew that space holds regions forbidden to travel to without explanation, and that the memory of such zones always remains with those who dared to enter. And as Helios 7 once again soared toward the stars, the crew knew they had transcended the limits of human understanding, and their experience would remain a mystery beyond words. A mystery that would live within them as they gazed upon the infinite cosmos, knowing that there existed realms where laws obeyed no one but the orbit itself.